Hello, everybody. It's my great privilege tonight to welcome Mohale Mashigo, the author in residence in Lorraine this year. A special thank you to Barbara Schmidt, Céline Sabiron, and Amy Peltier for having initiated such an amazing program for all of us, academics, students, pupils in high schools, but also readers all over the region who are excited to meet foreign authors and read their work. I would like to thank our sponsors too, Université de Lorraine, UT Charlemagne, UFR AEL Nancy, IDEA, and Métropole du Grand Nancy. So tonight is the fourth seminar out of a series of 5, and previously we welcomed many interesting guests who talked about Mohale or South African literature or African culture in general. But this one is special as we're going to listen to Mohale herself speaking about her own work, her novels, short stories, and comics. And the second part of the seminar will be a conversation between Mohale, Kathie Birat, and Cédric Courtois, and both regular guests by now. And we are not sick of you yet, Cédric. Those of you who are watching us on the Ariel YouTube channel, you are welcome and you are even encouraged, especially our master's degree students for whom we organize these seminars, to ask Mohale all the questions you wish. So please don't hesitate, write down your questions in the comment space on this YouTube channel. So before we start, I'd like to thank all my hardworking co-organizers, Céline, Marilyn, Claire, Nathalie, Estelle, and our research assistants, master's degree students, Lisa, Pauline, Elise, Eraste, Delphine, and also Victoire, second year BA student, who did a great job drawing the picture of the flyer for this seminar that you can see. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Luc Debert for his technical help with the Ariel YouTube channel. So now Lisa, my research assistant, who also designed all the beautiful flyers for these seminars, is going to introduce Mohale. And then Mohale, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Mohale Mashigo is a South African writer and singer-songwriter that we are welcoming to our university as part of the Ariel Author in Residence program. She is the author of the novel The Yearning, which won the University of Johannesburg Debut Prize for South African writing in English, and was shortlisted for both the International Dublin Literature Award and the first-time published Author South African Literary Award, as well as the short stories collection entitled The Intruders, in which she explores through fantastic settings the feeling of exclusion and invisibility that Black people face. She has also published children's books and is part of the writing team of Gwezi, a comics about the first South African superhero and the Black Panther Sins of the King audiobook produced by Marvel. In 2020, overall career.
Hello, everyone. I am Mohale Mashigo. Thank you very much for that intro. I've been watching the seminars over the weeks, and it's so nice to finally, be in one. I've heard all of these people talk about my work in relation to other people's work, and it was all very academic. So today I thought I'd take a different approach to speaking about my work from inspiration to publication. And so I thought we'd start at the very beginning with who I am, because that's important to consider. I do like to kind of, give this idea of who I am. And this is who I am. I am a South African. I was born in Soweto. And those two people are my parents. I grew up in a household where my father was a reader. We didn't have many books. So my dad will read anything you put down next to him. And my mom is the storyteller of the family. Whenever we were alone, she'd tell me all these fantastical tales. And sometimes she would even, she'd make up stories about people that we saw on the side of the road. And in terms of how I became a reader, because, all writers are readers to start with, I think I had access to some very interesting literature definitely not like highbrow or anything. So it was stuff like, Noddy, the Berenstain Bears, Pippi Longstocking, and all of this I actually had access to once I started going to school, because my parents couldn't afford to buy me books at the time. And so when I started going to school, I kind of had access to the Noddy books, the Berenstain Bears, and Pippi Longstocking, who I was very fond of. And as I got a little older and my parents were able to kind of buy me more books, then I started getting into comics like Wendy, Casper, and the Archie comics. And in high school, we had Sweet Valley High. And I don't know if you've ever watched or you've ever read Sweet Valley High books, but they're about these two sisters, Elizabeth and Jessica, and they're twin sisters, and they go through a typically kind of American high school experience. And at the time I was in high school, and as you can see from the slide, there wasn't much representation for a South African girl in the 90s in the kind of books that I was reading. So in high school, a friend of mine and I started writing Sweet Valley High fan fiction. And if you don't know what fan fiction is, I'm sure everybody knows what it is, but you basically take this text, what's canon, and you make it your own. So we took Elizabeth and Jessica over there in the corner, and we made them two Black South African girls who were living in Johannesburg and going through the kinds of things that we were going through. But I always felt that there was something missing. There was a distance between me and the literature that I was reading. I was always an observer, and I always like to describe the change that happened for me as a reader as 3 clicks. And I remember the first click very well. I was allowed to take out books, and my dad would kind of check that I'm, reading stuff that's appropriate. And somehow the first book that clicked was The Color Purple. And at this time, I don't think my dad at that point, he had gotten used to, kind of approving my books. So he just looked at the title. He was like, oh, The Color Purple. And of course, I can say in retrospect that it may have been a little inappropriate for me to read at the age that I was. But that first click with Alice Walker, it was the first time that I'd read a book. And when I say serious book, I mean a novel about Black people. And it was so fascinating because until then, I knew there was a void. I knew there was a distance between me as a reader and literature, but it clicked then that I didn't actually see Black people in literature. And Alice Walker's The Color Purple was the first click for me. That's when things started changing. So what changed was Alice Walker. And then the second click happened in high school when a high school teacher of ours introduced us to Tsitsi Dangaremba's nervous conditions. And if Alice Walker showed me, Black people in literature, Tsitsi really brought it home because my uncle was from Zimbabwe, and suddenly I was reading about people that I could have been related to. And I recognized some of the things in the book. And also, the protagonist, Tambuzai, was a young Black girl. She's talking about her experiences as a young Black woman in Africa. And before then, it had never occurred to me that could happen. And I think nervous conditions came after the time that we were writing Sweet Valley High fan fiction, and something really, really important happened because I thought, well, I don't need Jessica and Elizabeth. I don't need to make them Black and, kind of bend them into all of these shapes to fit my world. I could actually write about us. I could write about the girls in my high school. I could write about what I was feeling, because that's exactly what Tsitsi Dangaremba did. And I think the last click, the thing that made things click into place, was Zake Mda's Ways of Dying. And this I read when I was in university. It was actually recommended by a friend of mine, Cynthia. And something happened when I read Ways of Dying where I finally went, this is the kind of writer I think I want to be. Because, you know, ways of dying, this quote itself, death lives with us every day. Indeed, our ways of dying are our ways of living. Or should I say our ways of living are our ways of dying. That quote in itself showed me that I could deal with the difficult things, difficult topics, things that maybe I felt like people weren't dealing with, and it would be okay. And in Ways of Dying, it was done so beautifully with humor. And I mean, if you get to know me, you'll know I like to put humor in everything. And that was the final click that brought me to the point where I knew I wanted to be a writer. But even then, I didn't write while I was in university. All I did was consume all of this literature because, you know, now I had access to all of this literature where Black people were the protagonists, where they were the villains, and that was really good for me. So I suppose this is what a lot of people ask me, when did it all begin, the writing? And I will say that I was not ready to write, and I didn't know I was ready to write until I actually started doing it. And the backstory to this is in 2006, I was working at an advertising agency, and I was deeply unhappy. I've been in Cape Town for 2 years, and I was lonely. And so I think as a side effect of that, I hated my job. I hated my colleagues. Not all of them, I'm still friends with some of them, but I was just really, really unhappy. And so at lunchtime, when some of my colleagues would try to have lunch with me, I would avoid them by saying, oh, I'm busy, you know, with a brief or whatever at lunchtime. And a colleague of mine who shared a desk with me, she said to me, you know, if you're going to lie about doing work, at least open a document or something so people can see something on your screen. So I opened a Word document. I'm sorry, I live near a hospital and there's always helicopters or something. So I opened up a Word document, and I used to have my lunch at my desk. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that a story was forming right before me. I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know how it would end, but that's how I started writing The Yearning, at my desk at an advertising agency in 2006. And I mean, to say I knew that this would be my debut novel would be a lie, because as soon as I left advertising, I kind of abandoned the novel, and I carried on with my life in radio, you know, living, growing up, gaining new experiences. And then I felt the itch again, the writing itch, and I started writing again. And I started writing what will be my second novel, if I ever finish it. And my best friend said to me, how you do one thing is how you do everything. If you abandon The Yearning, you're going to abandon this story as well. So I started writing it. And I mean, I don't remember the time period, but I know that I was writing in queues. I was writing in my car. I was writing on little notes. I was emailing myself passages. And I was basically stealing time, because at the time I wasn't working as a writer, and I started to pay my bills and work in radio. And so I was writing The Yearning. I was actually stealing time because the story then started revealing itself and it became clearer. And I was just writing and writing and writing. And I guess that's how I got to The Yearning. And of course, then I kind of approached some publishers, and they said, no, thank you. All of the big publishers in South Africa said, no, thank you. Some of them had excuses. One, I remember saying, we have something similar in the pipeline. And so I know they were lying, because there's nothing out there like The Yearning. I can say that now. And so I decided I was going to approach the National Arts Council, because they have a grant for writers who want to self-publish. I was so determined to have this book published. And, you know, I'd already planned I was going to publish 100 copies, and my marketing plan was going to be my dad harassing people in church. So he was going to sell the book in church. I mean, this was a terrible marketing idea, but my dad was going to sell books in church, and my mom was going to harass people that were passing by, and they were going to buy this book, you know. And that was my idea. I was going to print 100 copies, and I was going to sell 100 copies. I eventually started looking for editors, because even at that stage, I knew that your book is nothing without an editor. Every writer needs an editor. So I started looking for an editor, and I found one, and I sent her the manuscript, and I said to her, tell me how much it would cost for you to edit this professionally. And she said to me, I love this, but I don't think you should self-publish it. And of course I was like, well, everybody's rejected me, so what do you want me to do? And she said, let me just contact one last person. Let's see if it happens. If it doesn't, then yeah, let's self-publish. And the one last person she contacted was my publisher right now, Andrea. Well, I think I contacted Andrea. I don't remember. It's all a blur. I think I contacted Andrea, and I said, listen, Ilana said I must contact you. She thinks you'd be interested in this. And Andrea said, yes, let's do it. And that's how I got published. That's how The Yearning got published. And in the last slide, or in the next slide, it's one of those lines, in our quiet denial, the yearning devours us. And these were the tiles that they used at the time for the marketing campaign. And there it says Picador, Africa, and you can see the book. And this was before the book was in stores, and the marketing department sent it to me, and I was so excited. I couldn't believe it. My story that started in 2006 and was abandoned on and off was now going to be published in 2016, and it was a huge deal. And of course, I hadn't told my family about it. I was just doing this secretly, and I think only maybe 3 of my friends knew for sure, because I didn't know what to expect, and I wasn't ready to share the news. So that is how it began. This is how my writing career began. And now, you know, I'm always asked, how do I write? You know, what's the writing process? And I think I'm a writer of my time. I know a lot of famous writers kind of have these notebooks, and they write all of this stuff. And I do buy a lot of notebooks, but it seems as though I always find loose pieces of paper. I mean, even now while I'm here creating, there's loose pieces of paper all over here that mean nothing to anybody who would read them except me. I write digitally. I use my laptop, and if I don't have it with me, I'll send myself voice notes on my phone. I use the Notes app. I email myself little things. So, you know, if somebody was snooping in my emails, they think I'm not well, because I send myself one-liners. You know, reminder, watch this, reminder, do this. And that's all for my writing. So a lot of my work is done digitally. And I think only when it's gone to my editor and she's had time to work with it and it comes back to me, that's when I print it. And I printed in one of those, I printed with all of the editor's notes in the margins, as you'll see there. And I'll have things highlighted. And then that is where I do a lot of my kind of understanding what the story needs. So my process is I start digitally, and once my editor has come into it, then it really helps me to have it, you know, printed and bound. And there I write little notes to myself, or sometimes I'll rip out a page and kind of have it on the kitchen, on the fridge, and look at it for a long time and go, there's something wrong with this sentence. There's something that just makes me unhappy. So editing for me is the difficult part. Writing is fun. I love writing, but editing is difficult because it's almost like you've given your beautiful baby to someone, and the editor says, I love your baby, but maybe your baby doesn't need 10 fingers. You know, maybe your baby needs 2 heads, or they're just like ripping your baby to shreds and saying, oh, what a bad pancreas your baby has. So I think that's why I edit on paper, because it's very it's very tactile, and I can write angry notes and highlight things. And eventually, of course, then I do the real editing digitally again. So that's my process. The ideas always start in here. I send myself little notes. I write on loose pieces of paper, and then I get typing, and it's just all happening on my laptop until we move to editing. And I think I'm learning how to be better at taking editing suggestions. I think I'm most sensitive when I'm editing. So one of the things I certainly didn't expect after the novel was published and it had won all of these awards was that people expected the work to be anthropological somehow. And that's something that I really didn't expect. I mean, obviously there are some South Africans who have experienced the same thing as the character, but there are other South Africans who some of the things that are dealt with in the book are so foreign to them, you know? And that's one of the things that I had to keep reminding people. It's fiction, you know. I'm not an expert. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an economist. I can't tell you why the rand has been going up and down. Do I think this scenario in the book affects this? And that's one of the things that came to me in my process, that at the end of it, people read your work and then they expect you to be an expert and almost like you're an anthropologist. And I always have to remind people it's fiction. That's all it is. It's fiction. I am a fiction writer. I'm an expert at the characters that I create. I'm an expert at creating, you know, fantastical things. I'm an expert at dialogue. And sometimes I do wish that when people spoke to me, they would ask me about the craft and less about, you know, all of this other stuff. And I found this quote from an article on brittle paper, African novels are not anthropological documents. And it basically says, I remember an American student asking after reading Things Fall Apart whether human sacrifice was a thing in Africa. Now imagine your first American novel were American Psycho. Would you ever think to ask an American if most American men were prone to a similar kind of psychosis? From years of studying British and African novels, I find that people make demands on African novels they don't make on other kinds of novels. Whether realist or fantasy, African novels are required to offer direct access to Africa's way of life. And I found this so confusing because I thought in most interviews, people would ask me about my craft. They would ask me about, you know, how long did it take? Talk about my use of dialogue. And suddenly I was being asked all of these things. And I find I'm being asked the same questions in France as well. And it stands out for me because when I read Madame Bovary, you know, I didn't call up every French person I know and say, listen, according to French history, blah, 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 blah. But apparently this is something that I had to deal with. It's my least favorite part of you know, discussing my work with people because I'm a writer. And that's what I am. I'm not an expert on, you know, South African psychology. I cannot speak for all of South Africa. I cannot speak for all of Africa. And that's one of the things that actually led me to writing Intruders. Because, you know, people are like, why short stories? And these short stories I'd actually been writing for a long time. I'd had this idea for Intruders, but I didn't think that it would be my second book, the short story collection. And I had some that were, I never actually am working on just one thing. It's one of those things about me. I don't know how to work on just one thing. So even now, I think I'm working on 4 different projects. And that makes me feel better as a writer, that I'm always moving between things and not being stagnant or stuck in one world. So, you know, people ask me why short stories, and I said, I don't know, but these ideas, these snapshots kept coming to me. And I like to compare short stories to you get on the bus and you hear 2 people talking and you hear some things and you're like, oh, that's interesting, but you're going to get off before those people. So you just had a snapshot into a conversation and now you're gone. And some of the high school students I've been working with were saying, you know, what happens next with characters like Nolwazi Bota? And I said, well, it was just a snapshot. I don't know what happens next. We were just stuck in that moment with that character. Nolwazi Bota is the protagonist in the short story On the Run. So I had all of these different snapshots. And the one thing they all had in common was that I was using speculative fiction tropes, you know, because I thought surely nobody would treat these short stories about mermaids, monster hunters, werewolves, vengeful spirits, and winged women as anthropological texts. They wouldn't say, is it true in South Africa? You know, homeless kids are sometimes a vampire or a werewolf. And I also wanted a step away from that. So, you know, all writers reflect on the times that they live in. So there were some reflections on South Africa, but I wanted to have a little bit of space between those kind of hard South African truths, because I think a lot of the characters in Intruders are intruders, right? There are people that are going through really difficult things, people that would maybe make newspaper headlines. So I chose short stories because I wanted snapshots. I just wanted a whole bunch of snapshots using speculative fiction. And I also didn't want people to treat me as an expert on, you know, tell us about the drug epidemic in South Africa, because I wrote Ghost Strain N, which was about substance abuse. You know, is the government doing enough of a job or whatever? I didn't want that. And I find I'm asked less of those questions when people ask me questions about Intruders. So I feel like maybe speculative fiction may be the cloak that I need. And so, you know, I worked in comics, and I think people wanted to know, where do comics fit in my life? And I mean, if you remember the earlier slide was, I've always read comics, but it was my younger brother who introduced me to superhero comics. So with Kwezi, I actually joined the team. Kwezi is South Africa's first superhero. And I'll tell you why it's not true that he's South Africa's first superhero. But I joined the team after reading 6 of their issues, and I was bold enough to approach the writers and say to them, look, guys, this is a really beautifully done comic, but the writing is terrible. And I'd hate for something so monumental to suffer because the writing is poor. And I would say, do not ask for a job and insult people in the same breath. Don't do it like that. Don't be like me. Although in my defense, we were having a couple of whiskeys, so I think everybody was relaxed. But I joined the team of Kwezi because I wanted to be part of this really important project. And I knew that I could bring something very different and something very specific to this team. They had all of this background in comics, and Loisa and Clyde have got a long history in comics, and I knew that I'm bringing in a different kind of storytelling, and it would help us elevate the art, it would help us elevate the story, and it would help us elevate the final project. And I then started working on Black Panther's Sins of the King with a cereal box, and I think that's when I realized that, I'm not just a comic book writer for Kwezi, I'm also just a comic book writer. And I feel like this is how my whole writing career has happened, that I do one thing and I think, oh, that's nice. And then suddenly I'm doing another thing in the same vein. You know, it's like the children's books as well. And where do comics fit in? They're just another voice that I use as a writer. They're another platform that I use as a writer. And I always like to end a talk with, people like to end with a quote or a funny story, but I think it would be great to end this talk with a did you know, an interesting fact. So earlier I said that Kwezi was not South Africa's first superhero. And in fact, a guy named Mighty Man, the human law-enforcing dynamo, was South Africa's first superhero. I'll tell you why most people don't know about him or don't acknowledge him. So Africomics is a comic book house that, so Africomics were published in the mid-70s, and it was part of an initiative that the Secretary of the Department of Information in the South African government from 72 till 77 kind of was heading up. And they published 2 titles, Mighty Man and Tiger Ingwe. Tiger Ingwe has got its own problems, but I want to speak specifically about Mighty Man, who was a cop. Surprise, surprise. And he had superpowers. And they were printing this, they were doing like 43,000 copies of Mighty Man a month, and they were selling it for 15 cents each. And in the words of the Secretary of the Department of Information at the time, it was a comic that was going to help educate the Black man in ways of Western society, social concerns, and enterprise. So it was propaganda. It really was. And I think UCLA has got some issues of Mighty Man digitally. And I mean, it's awful. It's awful. And the reason why it fell apart was because the people it was aimed at weren't idiots. And so they kept thinking, well, if Mighty Man is so great, if he's so powerful, why is he rescuing us from small-time Tsotsis, small-time criminals, and not from apartheid, which was the biggest problem of the time? So that's something you can tell people, something that you heard in a talk by a South African author, that Kwezi, while being New South Africa's first superhero, there was a little-known superhero called Mighty Man used by the propaganda department of South Africa in the early to mid-70s. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't taken up too much time, because I know we're still going to have a question and answer.
It was great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the tour you gave us, the backstage of your creative process, and your private workshop is always fascinating to know what happens in the head of a writer. So, of course, we have questions. I was wondering if you have a writing routine. Do you write every day? Do you have a writing schedule? Are you organized or disciplined about writing, or do you write to just meet deadlines? I was reading a book the other day, Daily Rituals, Women at Work, and I was wondering, I wonder how Mohale writes. Does she have a ritual too?
I am one of the most ill-disciplined writers I know. In fact, when I hang out with other writers, I think, wow, these people are serious. They say, oh, I was writing all day, and I'm not that way. And because while I'm writing a novel, I'm also writing things that have serious deadlines. I've just started writing for TV and film, and I write comic books now, not just Kwezi, but internationally. So I always have deadlines. So I think I'm always writing every day. And I try to wake up really early and get some exercise done and then write. And somehow between 10 a.m. and noon, I am the most useless person. Suddenly my brain doesn't work. And that's usually when I take a break to watch Netflix or, go for a walk. Mm-hmm. And then after midday, things kind of balance out again. So I would say this year, I've probably written every day, which is very unlike me, because I write everywhere. And, when an idea hits me, I send myself a voice note. I don't know if I have a certain routine as such.
Mm-hmm. You said you worked in advertising, and I was wondering, do you have a say in marketing or the choice of your cover for your books? Because I saw the beautiful covers you have for The Intruders and The Earnings. So how much do you participate in this process of, cover design, and do you have a say in the process?
Well, so in South Africa, which is where my main publisher is, we do get involved in it's a collaborative process. And I've been lucky enough to have a publisher that includes me in all of these things. And it's funny, that cover for The Yearning, I was not crazy about it the first time. I think there was another cover that my publisher and we really, really wanted it. And then the marketing department was like, no, we need something bright. We need something that'll stand out. And so I didn't like that cover for a long time, but now I really like it. That I can identify it anywhere. So I'm happy to say that the marketing department was right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have another question for you because you talked about inspiration. How do you get inspiration in this current situation of lockdown? Because there's no action, no excitement. And I know you are supposed to write a story about Nancy. And if it's based on real events and nothing happens, how are you going to manage this? You mentioned helicopters going around earlier. Or maybe your story will be based on, I don't know, encounters with different people, and we are all going to end up being characters in your short story. How?
Yeah, most of you will end up being characters in my short story. Well, not being characters, inspiring characters. I don't really have a problem with ideas, and I'm saying this, and I always tell people I don't believe in writer's block. You know, I simply can't entertain that, because imagine if I start entertaining writer's block. I'm neurotic. I would just have writer's block for 20 years if I entertained it. So I never have a shortage of ideas. As long as I see people, as long as I experience people, I can draw from a lot of lifetime experiences as well. So my ideas are all around me. My ideas are the people, the places, you know, the interactions. So yeah, the story that I have to write will definitely be a COVID time story. Definitely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I just know it. I've already started playing with some ideas, and I don't think I could have written something that's not a COVID story, because I arrived and a couple of weeks later we went into lockdown, you know?
Yeah. We've got questions from YouTube. Somebody says, as a young Black South African, The Yearning was a book I picked up while looking for South African literature. I've been hooked ever since and absolutely adored it. My question is, will the Untitled series from Intruders ever be a standalone book?
People love asking me this question. You know, Untitled actually happened in a really strange way, because I was putting the series together and I already had the first Untitled, and it was only going to be one. And while I was editing stories and putting them in order, I suddenly thought there's definitely another story that follows from this. And that's how Untitled 2 happened. And then I think right near the end, when I was about to submit it, Untitled 3 came to me. So I will say that these two characters, these two sisters, have very, very, very strong voices. And people ask me about whether Untitled will become its own book. And I think maybe, not right now, because I've got 2 books in the works, but definitely, yes, Untitled, soon come.
Okay. We've got another question from Ludovic, who is my student. Hello, thank you for mentioning Alice Walker and the color purple that I love. I found The Yearning somehow related to Walker's writing and concerns. Is she still an inspiration for you?
I think The Color Purple is one of my favorite books by her. So yeah, she's still inspiration in that way. You know, I don't think she'll ever stop, because she unlocked something in the reader in me. So yes, I think she will always have a special place in my reader heart and in my writer heart.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from Pauline too. You've touched a lot of different genres. Have you ever written or thought about writing poetry? And if not, do you still draw inspiration from it? I thought I noticed some influence from Worcestershire in the prologue of The Yearning, but I might be wrong.
Oh, wow. So, you know, you know how when we're teenagers and we're angsty, we all think we're poets. So we kind of write this poetry. Oh, I'm so sad. Oh, I hate my mom. Or, you know, whatever. So I was interested in poetry in that sense, that I was an angsty teenager. And then once I got over my angst, I looked back at the poetry and I thought, oh, this is bad. And so I destroyed all of it. But I don't think I would be a great poet. You know, there's a South African poet, Kollega Putuma, one of my favorite people on earth, and she's a poet. And once you've read Kollega's work, a person like me suddenly thinks, even if I maybe wanted to write poetry, there's this awesome woman, and that is who should be writing poetry, not me. And the influence from Warson is a very interesting, it's a compliment, but no, no influence from her at all. I think I'm familiar with maybe 3 of her poems, so I would say no.
I've got a question too. How do you react when you read scholarly articles or even PhDs about your work written by academics? Do they always get it right? And do you think that being discussed in academia is a sign that your work matters, or maybe you're simply happier to know that readers in general appreciate your work, or both academics and readers in general?
So I have a rule that is, once the book is edited and it's gone to print, it doesn't belong to me anymore, you know, and it's now in the hands and minds of other people, and people always approach a book or a text even with all of their history, their personality, their psychology, and so they interpret a lot of things, and I really, sometimes I hear their interpretations, and I think it's fascinating. When it comes to academics discussing my work, well, that's interesting. I didn't think it would happen, so I just think, oh, that's interesting, that's nice. But I try not to read reviews or what people think of my work, because it's none of my business.
All right. I've got a question from Vanessa Guinery, who is my colleague from Lyon. Many thanks for your presentation, Mohale. How do you approach narrative voice in your writing? Do you know from the start if it's going to be a first or third person narrative voice, or do you experiment as you go along? And do you read your work aloud to hear the voices you create?
I think what I found is I never know what the voice is going to be, right? Because this is how it happens. I've got this story idea in my mind, so I know this is the person, this is what's going to happen, and it's kind of happening in my head. And as soon as I start writing, the voice itself appears in a way that the story requires, you know. So sometimes it's in first person. I love first person because then we're taking a journey with one person and we're seeing the world through their eyes. But sometimes that doesn't necessarily work. So I think I only know once I start writing that this is what's correct. And I don't think I've ever corrected, you know, use of first or third once I've started, because I trust, and this is a weird thing to say, but I trust myself once I start writing. But I never plan if it's first, second, or third. It kind of just happens. It's how it happens on the page. And I definitely do read my work out loud, but not in the way to hear the voices that I create, because the characters are very clear in my head by the time I'm writing, which is why I take a long time to think about things and, you know, make all of these silly notes. By the time I sit down, I can hear all of the characters and I know what they would or wouldn't say. I only read my work out loud when I'm editing, so I can hear the rhythm. Or sometimes I'll do it before editing. Sometimes when I read something and I think the rhythm of that is not okay, I'll read it and I'll say it aloud, and then I'm like, okay, I know what's wrong with it.
Right. And maybe one last question. Somebody who has 3 questions. Did you choose the order of the stories in Intruders? And also, can you comment on the titles of each section, the good, the bad, and the beautiful? And finally, did you have to select just a few stories for Intruders? Are there more of the short stories out there waiting to be published?
Wow. Okay. So I'm not one of those writers that's like, oh, this is a story that was left over. I know these are the stories. I write them and I know these are the stories. None of them are going to fall away. In terms of the good, the bad, and the colorful, that's very interesting because some of those characters come across as good in the first section, and some of them are less, are characters you would be less sympathetic to. And then the colorful is really all of these colorful characters. And in terms of the order, I only knew which ones were going to make it into the good, the bad, and the colorful. And I think we spoke about the order with my publisher, kind of the flow. But I always knew how many stories there were going to be. I didn't think, oh, I should have put this story in or whatever, which is what kind of happened with Untitled. I knew the work was incomplete when the two Untitles just kept coming to me, because yeah, some characters do have stronger voices, I think. But that's not to say, and I'm actually now realizing I'm answering somebody's question here. My stories are not led by the characters at all. I just happen to be very, very clear about who they are and what they sound like. But I always have a starting point and an end point. What it looks like, what that journey looks like, I have no idea of. And sometimes the ending is a little different, but it's still what I intended. Yeah. So it's always a wild ride from beginning to end when I'm writing.
Right. So thank you very much, Mohale. Thank you very much and now we'll have our conversation. But first of all, can I ask you to switch your camera off and then turn it on again, because your picture is frozen for us. So maybe it's your internet connection. Okay. So meanwhile, Lisa is going to introduce Kathie, Cédric, and Richard, and then Mohale will be back with us for the conversation. Thank you very much. Yeah, now it's better, Mohale.
Thank you.
Kathie Birat is an emeritus professor of English at the University of Lorraine. She has published numerous articles on American, African American, and Afro-Caribbean writers. She is especially interested in questions relating to voice and orality. She edited a special edition of Commonwealth Essays and Studies devoted to Carol Phillips in 2017. Cédric Courtois is an assistant professor at the University of Lille, specializing in Nigerian literature. He has published various articles and book chapters on the rewritings of Bildungsraum genre in contemporary Nigerian fiction, mobility studies, refugee literature, and LGBTQ studies. Richard Samin taught at the University of Lorraine from 1988 to 2009. Since 2009, he has been an emeritus professor. Formerly, he taught French and English in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Côte d'Ivoire for 16 years. His field of study focuses on South African literature, history, post-colonial studies, and literary theory.
Kathie, I think you need to put your mic on.
Okay, there we go. Okay, it's on?
Yeah.
Yes, it's on.
Okay, so we're going to have a little conversation with you on the basis of some questions, and Richard Samin also gave us suggested some questions, which is, you may have noticed, are more specifically oriented on South Africa, because he knows South Africa much better than we do. Bessie Head, who is a writer, and Lillian Goyi, a trade unionist and
once my parents and I were driving, and she had this red convertible, and she would do things like this. I would have loved just to have dinner with her, and it would be one of those long dinner magazine that called her the Madonna of the Madonna of Soweto or something. But of course, no, Madonna Wishes. She had the kind of star power that Brenda.
You also sing, don't you?
Yes, although I haven't been on stage or been with my band, sitting by herself. Maybe she'll be in the kitchen and my dad will be in another room. We'll all be in separate rooms and somebody will start singing a song and then have your music on the side. And so I got myself piano lessons as soon as the closet, because that was kind of his soundproof space. So I'm on stage. I'm going to take a break from putting out books, because everybody needs a break, I mean.
That you draw from? Is there any specific?
And they come out through my work. So I wouldn't know, because I would have to, turn the gaze this way.
Eyeball music, meaning that she couldn't possibly know who Mariah Carey, for example, was back into
contemporary South Africa, because I feel as though people that have ideas, should someone be reading it, they know, oh, okay, these people,
intruders and the phonetic writing of intruders. And I do have the impression that, and to observe,
inspiring others. And I really want people to go, wow, South Africans are writing. Mm-hmm. And they're not just writing with one voice. You know, I don't want it to just be educated middle-class women like myself. No, I want everyone to write. I want them to write, and I want them to have access to, access in terms of them being in libraries, people talking about their work. And so, no, we've only just begun.
What about Zakes Madar? Could you say a little bit about him? I just read Ways of Dying, which I really liked.
Oh, did you?
I really loved it, but I must say that for someone who is not from South Africa and doesn't know South Africa very well, at the beginning you're a little bit disoriented, but I got the feeling that basically the character, what's his name, Toloki?
Yeah, Toloki is.
Toloki, that it's sort of a way of showing a character who is observing the world around him and choosing this man who has chosen this unusual profession of being a professional mourner is sort of a way of introducing us into that world. I found it was really wonderful. I loved it.
Yeah, and if you felt disoriented in the beginning, it's because Zakes wanted you to, So even for me, when I first started reading the book, I was like, what? What is this? But he drew me in from the beginning. So Zakes is one of my very good friends, but also somebody that I look up to as a writer and just as a person. He just has this way of writing that kind of, you never feel tense. There are those books that you kind of feel like this the whole time because it's dealing with such heavy material. And when Zakes writes, it's got humor. It's very, very human, and it's got layers. And I admire him very much. And, when we first became friends, I said, I can't believe I'm friends with one of my favorite writers. And we jokingly call each other BFF, best friends forever. He is really one of my favorite people in the world and one of my favorite writers. I have all the time in the world for Zakes Madar.
But he now, for instance, in Ways of Dying, he does introduce a little bit of magic realism. Like with the business about the pictures on the walls, when he puts pictures on Noria's walls and they seem to walk into the pictures and they imagine another world, but he doesn't do it very heavily. But
it's funny that because when I read that, I didn't think it was magic realism. It's like when we were younger, right? We'd like open up the magazines and then there'd be like a picture of a meal. And we'd all go, we want this meal. This is my meal. This is my car. Kind of getting lost in a thing that is outside of your circumstances, kind of like an escapism. So I didn't view that as magic realism. But yeah, he's great. He's got one novel called The Whale Caller, and you also kind of get lost in the story of a man who's in love with a whale. And I mean, just saying it is ridiculous, but when you read it, it's just he'll take you anywhere and everywhere, and you trust him enough as a writer to follow him where he's going.
I'd like to talk about a slightly different aspect that I don't think we've talked about yet, which is the question of space in South Africa. And of course, this is one of the things that left me a little bit disoriented in Madar's novel. He would make a distinction between village, city, town, and not having it in front of my eyes. I sort of had trouble imagining those spaces and how he was using them. Now, you, in The Yearning, at one point, the narrator talks about things that she didn't understand because she was a township child. Now, could you explain what you mean by a township child?
Oh, that just means, living in an urban area, because it's kind of like and I'm assuming here that people who live in provincial or rural France speak very different French from people who are born in urban areas. And that's really all it is. It's a distinction between how an urban area will affect how you speak your mother tongue because you're around people who speak other languages, and how people who are in a rural community surrounded by, or provincial or rural area, surrounded by people who speak the same language as them, would have I don't like to use the word pure, but would have a different kind of accent and a different kind of access to the language than, say, somebody in an urban area. So those are the two distinctions, and I would imagine the same thing kind of applies here, where there are people who speak a very rich, layered type of French, as opposed to kids who grew up in an urban French city.
Mm-hmm. Because in the yearning, at one point, the narrator says, like many kids who grew up in rural spaces, I was not afraid of my body and did not consider it something to be ashamed of. Mm. What do you mean by that, about the body?
I think also in that rural versus urban spaces. In urban spaces, you aren't walking around in your cultural clothes, or we're constantly covered up. We've got schools, we've got, clothes for church, clothes for school, clothes for at home, and even our ideas of our bodies in urban spaces, because there's so many people, so many influences, are influenced by the church. They come from kind of whoever brought the religion with them, their puritanical views of, bodies and women. And I would say during my childhood, I don't know if that's changed, I just found that my family members who were living in not urban spaces were much more open about their bodies. They just had a different view of it. And I think maybe it has something to do with being in urban areas and being exposed to Western ideas of what bodies are, what they do, what's a beautiful body, what's a clean body.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question, but there was a YouTube question that was asked by Moses, and I thought it was interesting, quite provocative and quite interesting. He wrote, I would like to know your take on the assumption by some literary critics that women writers get published because they are in activism, but not because of their literary strength. And I was listening to you a little bit earlier, and you did talk about the fact that you would like so many stories to come out written by, for example, disabled South Africans, as you said, or LGBTQ South Africans, and so on, so people belonging to the margins in general. And to what extent is your writing, in a way, political and an activist also writing, maybe?
Well, I don't know if it's activist writing, but to answer Moses's question, I think if you're not a man, if you're not a white man, then your writing is activism, because it's like, oh, look, the others brought a little voice with them. And they only consider it that because they're basically saying it's charity. Oh, look at the women, they're writing. So I do know that happens. I really try to ignore that. And I think it will only ever change if there's more people like me writing, because then actually you can start looking at the literary merits of people's works and saying, this writer is better at this and that writer is better than that. But for as long as we're the 20%, shame, the women are writing, of course they'll think it's activism. And I think they also think because we're women, we're writing women's issues, whereas I'm a writer and I write people's issues, because surprise, women are people as well. And I think that's why I say we need more disabled writers. We need more LGBTQI writers, because I don't want them to have to go through this, oh, look, they're writing, because they're writing about people. We all write about people. And so how can it be activism? What does that say about the work of men?
Yeah.
It's just entertainment, it's pleasure, but we have to toil our whole lives.
I have a question which has nothing to do with what we've just talked about, but have you, because there's this huge literary prize in Africa, the Cane Prize for best short story every year that is awarded. Are you planning to participate in this, or have you participated already, and what do you think of maybe this? There seems to be a huge energy around the short story in Africa, which is something that I'm not sure I'm totally right, but it's not a genre that is very read in France, for example. It's not a genre that French people really like reading. They prefer reading novels. And what's your take on this really great importance of short stories in Africa in general?
I must admit, when I first started reading, I didn't read a lot of short stories, right? And it wasn't until I don't know how many years ago that I suddenly just found access to all of these short stories that were written by South African writers pre-94, post-94. I was reading short stories by Argentinian writers, just from all over the world. And suddenly I love these snapshots. It's like opening a themed kind of photo album. And you look at these photos here or whatever, and I loved it. I can't speak to why there's suddenly a rise in short stories, only that I suddenly had access to so many of them. And I was like, hey, I think I want to do that. But, I sometimes think about, like you said, French people prefer novels. And I think, is it because a lot of people aren't writing short stories that they do prefer novels? Or a lot of people don't write short stories because people prefer novels? And now we're both sitting here going, that's what it is. But in terms of the Cane Prize, I've never really thought about writing something for the Cane Prize. I know it's important, and I know it's important to a lot of writers. I've just never thought about it because I feel like since 2015, when we started editing The Yearning, I've constantly been working on something. And so I really haven't had like a nice leisure story to write that isn't attached to something and then get it published somewhere and then submitted to the Cane Prize. Maybe one day.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you a question more related to what's been happening to you in France, so we can sort of, although you've said you've been asked some questions, you're expected to be an expert on South Africa, but I've lived in France for 45 years, and people can still surprise me with questions about the United States. So this never you're always a curiosity wherever you're in a foreign country. But I'd like to ask you what you've learned from giving writing workshops since you've been in Nancy.
So I've been giving writing workshops. I've worked with high school students, and I've worked with some university students. And the one thing that has struck me is that a lot of the students are very shy to call themselves writers. There's kind of this idea that you're either born a writer or once you're published, you are a writer.
Welcome to France.
Yeah.
And then we do these writing workshops, and I push them. I say, be creative right now on the spot. And suddenly all of these stories start pouring out of people. And I think it surprises them as well. It never surprises me when that happens, but I am surprised at how kind of shy the students are with sharing ideas. And that's something that struck me, because then when they do share ideas, they have some of the most interesting ideas. And when they are pushed to kind of just, take their imagination wherever, they certainly deliver. So I wish there were more creative writing workshops with the students, because I can feel they do want to be creative. They want it badly. They're just so shy.
But this is beginning to be done in France, even in universities, but just a little bit. But it is true that in France, you get the impression that in order to be a writer, you have to come out of the École Normale Supérieure, you know, the highest level school in France, and that otherwise you just don't have a chance. So in school, children are not encouraged to be creative. Now, how is this in South Africa? What was your experience as a student? Were you encouraged to use your creativity?
I feel like that's all we ever do in South Africa. South Africans are so immensely talented. I mean, from the time you get into school, you're encouraged to just have a voice. You know, if you can dance, then just dance all the time. If you can draw, then draw all the time. And not necessarily for it to be a career, though. So that's the funny thing about South Africa. We're just talented, you know. And I often watch people who post videos on TikTok or Instagram, and I go, that person has got a day job as an engineer, but he's so funny. You know, that person has got a day job as a doctor, but they cook really well, and they've got their little, you know, YouTube videos cooking. So in South Africa, we're very expressive, very, very expressive.
And generally speaking, how would you compare French people with South Africans from that point of view, from the point of view of expressivity?
So I think there's a lot of formal things that happen in France, lots of like formalities, and I think that sometimes gets in the way of expressing yourself. I found that with the students, that I have to reassure them that I'm not your teacher. I'm not going to tell your teacher what you create. It's okay. And it takes a while to kind of like chip away at the formality. Whereas when I work with South African students, I go, this is who I am. This is what we're going to do. And of course, there is that initial human shine, like, oh, I can't do it. But then they just like come out of their shell and create. Whereas here, I feel like there's the extra boundary of, have to get rid of the formalities. I'm not your teacher. I'm not going to mark you on this. I will not judge you. We're just having fun. And once I've chipped away at that, that's, you know, half of the workshop. And then in the second half, we can have fun.
Cédric, do you have any more questions?
Well, maybe still about your experience in France, and have you been asked surprising questions about yourself first, maybe, but also about your country and
you know, no, I have not been asked anything that I thought was surprising, but there is a little wine shop here, and I went to the wine shop, and the man asked me, where are you from? And I said, oh, I'm from South Africa. And he just said, long live Mandela. And I was like, I said, well, not really, but I appreciate the sentiment. He is no longer alive, but yes, I appreciate the sentiment. So that was really, really funny. That was like one of those things that I thought was hilarious. But one of the things I appreciate about French people is, you know, I've spent some time in Germany, and German people follow the rules. French people are lawless like South Africans. I feel right at home here. People are lawless, and I love it.
Yeah, and that's and I include myself in this when I say that we might not have a lot of knowledge about South Africa. That's very true. The fact that, yeah, obviously Nelson Mandela, and that's pretty much it. Yeah, so that's what would come up first. Yeah, very interesting.
I have a question about your first name, Mohale, which is your pen name. And I read somewhere that it was your mother's maiden name. And is this a homage to your mother, and maybe saying that your mother is not only part of your personal identity, but also part of your identity as a writer, as a storyteller?
Yes, definitely. I think had my mother been born in the same time as me, she would have been an amazing playwright. She just has a way of gathering people and characters in her mind. I think she definitely would have been amazing at writing plays as well as children's books. She's just lovely. And I know that, she didn't have the opportunity to do that because of the time she lived in South Africa. So when it was time for me, I mean, I could have used my real name, but I thought I want her to know that I am where I am because of her, and we're doing this together. This is our victory. So yes, Mohale is my mom's maiden name. And that was very important for me to do, because I feel like her name would have been on plays and whatever, but it wasn't meant to be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I have another question. How difficult is it to be a professional writer in South Africa? I mean, being able to write and make a living out of it without having a normal boring job. And I heard you worked in advertising before, so is it difficult to just be a professional writer and enough money to live out of your writing?
Yeah, it is very difficult to make a living as a writer in South Africa because, one, the reading public is so small, books are so expensive, and when people have to make a decision between books or food, they're going to choose food because books are so expensive. And I think it's taken me 4 years to find I think this is the first year, if I'm not mistaken. No, halfway through last year, that's when I started making money from writing only. But it's not because I was writing novels that are bestsellers. It's because I was writing for comics. I was writing for TV. So I wanted to keep writing even if it wasn't just my novels. And it's, since last year, halfway through last year, that's when I started writing full time.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to make a living from writing, but it can be done. It just takes patience.
All right. We've got a question from YouTube from my student, Ludovic. He said, talking about the female body, we saw last week that it's central in South African female writers' writing, often damaged by men. And he says, do urban versus country opposition applies? I'm not sure what he means. Like, is there a difference between urban and country in terms of female body?
Oh, yeah. So I think I may have answered that when I was talking about the differences between, attitudes towards bodies, because in urban areas, you're closer to, Western influences, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know if the female body is central in South African female writers' writing. Honestly, I'm trying to think. I think in The Yearning, it was important because her pain and her trauma was somehow stuck in her body. But I don't know if it's central. I have to be honest, because now I'm trying to think of other women writers. I don't know. I don't think that's so. I'd have to look into that. That's a very interesting question, Ludovic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And maybe one last question. We're talking about the body, and I know you said that your fiction it's all fiction. It's all about characters and plot and dialogues, and you focus on the story or the aesthetics of the story. But you don't really consider yourself a political writer. You seem to say, no, I'm just focusing on my story. But don't you think that beyond being a storyteller, beyond telling entertaining, fantastic stories, don't you think it's important to make readers aware of important issues in our society and political issues that have a wide relevance in South African society, like race, violence, gender, drugs, the body, inequalities, and things like that?
Well, I think I don't, whenever people say political writer, they mean a very specific thing. And so I think in South Africa, there's very little that's not political, just based on our history. And I mean, even in the Yearning, apartheid features, you know, where Marubeni and her mom live, her mom having to go off and start her business, how her father disappeared, because I think this was during state of emergency. So there's no way that I can write a South African story that is not somehow affected by apartheid. South African, the existence of a person in South Africa is very, very political, but I like the politics, the personal politics of my characters. Their personal politics, how they move around the world, how they move around in their communities and in their relationships. So I wouldn't say I'm apolitical, because that would just be silly. I'm a Black woman existing in the world. Of course, I'm political, but I'm just wary of labels, because all of those labels also come with a side of othering, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's not torture you anymore with the questions, and thank you very much for this lively and stimulating conversation, Mohale, Kathie, and Cédric. There have been problems with the live session on YouTube tonight, unfortunately, but I hope people will watch this again with a better picture and a better sound. And of course, all these will be transcribed by Pauline and Lisa and published in the Ariel volume dedicated to your residency. So thank you to our YouTube viewers, despite all the technical problems. And please do not miss our last seminar next week on Thursday evening, but this time at 6 o'clock, not 5:30 anymore. And this, the last seminar is about the translation of Mohale's The Yearning into French, and also about literary prizes celebrating Mohale's work. And we've also invited Mohale's publisher to join us. So it should be a very interesting session next week. So have a nice evening and goodbye. Thank you very much to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Mohale.
Thank you, Mohale.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you, Monica.